We're going to begin our next session on creation and creatureliness and narration. You will hear a bit from the panel, but I would like to introduce the panel chair, James K. Smith. Along with being a profoundly adept commentator on philosophy of phenomenology, a wonderful commentator on St. Augustine, one of our leading lights on questions of moral formation and education. Jamie Smith is not only a leading thinker, but a leading institution builder on questions of beauty, aesthetics, and image. And so Jamie is the perfect person to lead our time today. So welcome to Duke University, the Divinity School, and welcome to our panel.
Thank you. Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Kat. I'm so excited that you're here. This is great. Good morning, everyone. Rowan Williams was typically brilliant and beautiful. And so it's a joy to be able to continue a different kind of conversation, but extending that conversation in this marvelous space. I'm here in a role mostly just to activate two brilliant people so that we can listen to them muse on these questions. Amy Peeler from Wheaton College, New Testament scholar, pastor, theologian, and Chigozie Obioma, a novelist, recently transitioned to the University of Georgia. You can find all of the details of all of their brilliance and productivity in your app, but I'd rather give us time to be in conversation with them. The focus of this morning's seminars is on the sort of creed's emphasis on creation, creativity. And our particular focus here is on the role of narrative and creativity. And I think this continues the spirit of surprising encounters that we set up last night, which is, I think it's so fun to put a biblical scholar and a novelist in conversation talking about narrative and to see just where this goes. We don't know where it's going to go. This is improv. This is improv as we're unfolding. I thought maybe, just as a way to kind of warm us up and to hear from each of you, I'd be intrigued to know, do you each have a story, a narrative that factors into what you do now? Does that make sense? Amy, is there a story about your becoming a New Testament scholar who's interested in narrative?
That's a beautiful question. I think the stories that orient my work are the relationships that happen primarily for me with students. Hearing their questions about passages, say in Hebrews, is a mighty motivation for me to interrogate those passages, or frequently, men, but more often women, where do I fit in Christianity? And it's those that give me the fodder for my work. I'm intrigued then to go to the text and say, well, how have these relationships and conversations, how do they motivate me to define those treasures in the text that I could bring forth, not as the final answer, but as one thing that might assist them in their struggles?
Yeah, that's beautiful. It reminds me of that great line from Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. He says, I cannot answer the question, what ought I to do, unless I can first answer the question of what story am I a part? Oh. And in some ways, you're helping people sort of discern calling, vocation by helping locate them in the story. It's really wonderful. It's beautiful. Chigozie, how is there a story to your becoming a fiction writer, a writer of stories?
Yeah, well, wonderful. It's great to be here, this austere space. I feel like I should just fall asleep here and have to be dragged out. I grew up in Nigeria it's not a small town. It's sort of a mid-sized town in the west of the country. And it was in the days of Diego Maradona, Bebeto, and all these great footballers. Not the ones who throw with their hands, but the ones who kick with their feet. And for some reason, I cannot explain how, but it might have been just over watching these players play, but I wanted to be a football player. That was the thing, and I was very good at it. I was very good, uh, and um, and so, but something happened. I began to play in very dangerous places. I would sometimes even leave school as a truant and play in these swampy areas with mosquitoes, and then I would end up at the hospital. So there was a spell of this from age 7 to just 8.5 ish, and so repeatedly I would end up at the hospital and on this thing called drips, intubation. So at the time, so certain strains of malaria had to be flushed out with that. And it was this time, during this period, that my life changed. So it just so occurred to me that I wanted my parents to tell me stories. You know, that was the thing that comforted me. And they began to do that. And I would close my eyes and just, I like to call it the landscape of the imagination. I would escape into this territory that was completely and wholly private to me. Nobody else, even though they were speaking the words, but it was becoming, to use biblical language, flesh in my mind. And so I thought it was the most amazing thing. I thought my parents were geniuses. And I would go back to school and tell everybody, man, my dad can tell the stories. Can you imagine? Like he could see these things, people who don't exist. And then one day, you know, I was like closer to 9. And of course, we were going to school. I knew about reading, but it was all these, you know, folk tales and children's stories, not the kind of stories that they told me about a warrior from the 15th century, you know, Igbo village who fought all these people. And, you know, these were different. So, and then, you know, I went to my dad. I'm like, you know, could you please tell me a story? Is it only when I'm sick that you would do that? And he was like, Chigozie, you can read now. Why don't you just read one for yourself? And then he pointed to his bookshelf. So my dad, for some reason, trafficked in Shakespeare and all of these things. He had all these, you know, in fact, they had one called Lamb Tales from Shakespeare. They were condensed versions, you know, and from the British thing. But the one that I got and first read was a book by Amos Tutuola. I think the first African novel, I would say, sub-Saharan novel in the English language, even though it was like this mangled, corrupted form of English. But I read this book, and it was one of the most fascinating stories that my dad had told me. So he'd gotten it from that book, and then he'd made it as if it was his own.
You learned your dad's plagiarism in this
Exactly.
process.
So I was like, so this is where the stories are. This is the source of this thing that just amazed me. And I began to read. I lost the flair for football. Like my friends, I broke, like, you know, I had no friends. I was reading to the extent that at some point, they had to register me at the local library, and I would wake up on Saturdays in the morning. They would drop me at 8 o'clock, and I would have to be dragged out of the place. You know, I was so skinny because I was just reading so much. So that's how I became a writer.
Fantastic. It's a great, great story. Two things strike me. First is almost the environmental conditions that were there and available for you to be activated, insofar as your folks had a library, right? And there's a way in which that was a condition of possibility for your creativity. But what I was really intrigued when you said you're lying in the hospital. I'm sorry about that. And your parents are telling you a story, your father's telling you a story, and you know it's getting enfleshed in your imagination, and that seems to say something about the kinds of creatures we are, that we have this capacity. I mean, it's an amazing capacity, even though if your dad was stealing the story, to tell the story, but then we also just have this deep need and resonance as the receiver of stories, to sort of think narratively. And I think that's part of what we want to explore today. Amy, I'm intrigued in your work. So, in you're writing commentaries on Hebrew. Hebrew seems to be your jam.
A lot of time, yes.
Yes, yeah, which is great. But in your book, Women in the Gender of God, narrative is actually sort of really central because you're homing in on the incarnation narratives, the birth narratives. And it strikes me, if we keep thinking about this in terms of the Nicene Creed, the creed is quite remarkable in you think of how much of our credo is a story. The credo is a drama and about what happened. Tell us a little bit about, for those who might not be familiar too, tell us a little bit about that project, and then tell us about your creativity in that project, if that's works.
I so appreciated that question because I don't think for a long time I ever thought about my work as being creative. And so even the invitation to be here feels a bit like I don't quite fit. So I just want to listen to you because I feel like what a novelist does is what feels like a pure creativity. But I think I have matured in my understanding that those of us who write theology, biblical studies, exegesis, it is not as if we are simply repeating the words on the biblical page. There is this human act of transformation and communication that happens. And so when I began to work on that project, I was afforded a sabbatical, and at the beginning of that, for probably 2 months, every day, just sat with the texts that mention Mary, particularly the Annunciation narrative, and was bowled over by the riches and depth that truly was probably the best writing season of my life. Now, I was also in St. Andrews for my sabbatical, so that was like a super bonus. But to be there every day in this beautiful place, to sit with God's word, and this is the joy of an exegete, and I feel like where creativity comes in, because the wonder of language is such that the construction of the Greek, and that's where I spend the majority of my time. I know the Hebrew and it's beautiful, but I'm not as adept there. The beauty of the Greek is in this careful construction of how the words fit together, but then there are also gaps in the narrative, right? Pieces of the story are given, but if you employ an imagination, you realize that some parts of the story aren't explicitly communicated, and so you have to imagine. So it was one step to read the stories that I might have been familiar with growing up in church. I've heard about Christmas. But to discover the wonder in the text itself. And then there was a whole second process of asking the question, if this is the center of our Christian faith, what does this say about God? And that's where I really transgressed the boundaries and went beyond biblical studies to investigate questions of theological language and the nature of God, the nature of anthropology. And that was so scary. But I eventually felt like my rootedness in the text allowed me the possibility of hopefully saying something helpful about how we construct and think about and rightly respond to the revelation of God.
Can you say a little bit about a little bit more about the way the gaps in the narratives do those gaps have a function in the drama of the story, or are they invitations that compel us to fill in the gaps? I'm really intrigued by the not said in the narrative.
I think there could be different reasons for each. The one that comes to mind immediately is that, and other theologians have spoken of this, but in Luke's narration between Mary's acceptance, let it be unto me according to thy word, and then Elizabeth's pronouncement, how is it that the mother of my Lord should come to me, right? This is on one page of scripture. So between her acceptance and that realization by Elizabeth, the incarnation has happened. And yet, it seems right to me that that moment is so holy, the mystery so profound, that it is only presence in the gaps, that it cannot, Luke has chosen by the provision of the Holy Spirit not to articulate the mechanics of God becoming flesh. We know the reality, but we aren't given a window into the moment because it is simply too holy for us to see and articulate.
Oh my gosh, there's so much I want to talk about. Because two things. There's something apophatic here, it seems to me, right? In other words, there is actually a preservation of the fullness and plenitude and mystery and miracle of what's going on here by not putting it on screen. And that's so I'm reminded of Keats' notion of negative capability, which is you actually have these absences that are doing an incredible amount of generative work. I've never ever thought of that moment, that shift in the narrative in that way before.
It's my favorite page of the Bible.
That's such a cool,
And that's
cool
such a tactile thing, but that page of Luke is where God met us, as we heard so beautifully this morning. And I know it's not on the page itself, but there's something preserved for us that I might wish to be buried with that page.
That's wow. That is really, really beautiful. Paul Schrader, the filmmaker, in his book Transcendental Style in Film, talks about how the transcendental style is the filmmaker kind of draws the audience, it sort of baits you, it entices you, and then it pulls away exactly what you want. But what that does is it makes you, as the viewer, all of a sudden participate and long and crave. And I think it's there's a certain analog going on there that's really, really beautiful. Do you want to be buried with the Greek page?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah, no question.
Yeah. That's great.
I mean, like English translations are awesome. I'm on a committee, but those of you who know me know my Greek Bible is weathered. It is falling apart. The pages are so thin.
Let's build on this a little bit.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would also add that. See, I like what you said, Amy, but also it's also because the Bible is also a sort of a spiritual book. See, I think Jesus says that the words that I speak, they are spirit and they are life. So there is in my engagement with the Bible, there's something that I see in. So I could read, and I've tried this recently. I've read the book of Ephesians maybe 10 times, over and over again. And I underline something. I write it out. As I read, I write out in a different page in my own handwriting. Even that act of transmitting it into my own writing does something. It gives me a new window into each word, and so there's something alive about the Bible. It connects to something deeper. It's not something even less, I would say, intellectual or cerebral, but it's almost as if it engages with that imaginative thing or component in my mind or my brain, but also with even much more. So that is the life, I think, that it gives. So that's where I think in some ways the gaps also come in, because you're trying to engage with divinity through human language.
I'd love to pose a question to you that I've often wondered, especially for those of you who work in creative fiction. Many stories, I think, can impact us in that way, right? Not just intellectual, but they pull our hearts, right? I shared with you how I was shaped by the novel of yours that I read this summer. So powerful. Got in my thinking in a way that also got in my body, and I wanted to process that. So would you articulate, and any answer is fine, I'm just curious your thought, but does Scripture do that in a different way that other powerful things, or is there a resonance there? How would you describe the impact that literature makes on us, sacred Scripture and others?
I mean, obviously, novels can be transcendent, and they should be. I think that is the height that any, I don't like to use the word great, but any effective fiction should aim for. It's that position where it can open itself to so much meaning. Even a certain passage can be can translate itself into so many things. So the layering is how you do that, I think, at least in terms of the practice of writing a novel. And definitely you do that with the gaps, with the unseen, the mysteries that you leave on the page. So I like to give my creative writing students a sort of a scenario when I teach, the idea of creative gaps in fiction. In fact, as a rubric for creativity. So imagine that I come and give a lecture, with my deep voice and Nigerian accent, and no matter how interesting it is, if I just give that lecture, they are going to just fall asleep, or their minds will wander. They will start thinking of the dinner or the Bulldogs, playing Alabama or Duke, and all of that kind of stuff. But if the seminar is collaborative, every now and then I make jokes. I will be like, "Hey, Paul, I had this dream last night where you were reading this passage and you were telling all your friends about how great it is," and they would crack up, and and then they would, they begin to engage. Then they never almost miss anything that I say, and I might be giving the same lecture, but the mode is different. So that to me is really is how you create. So if you tell your reader everything, then there's no room for them to. So participation in fact, involves the reader in the art of creation. They begin to participate in the writing. And this actually came to a sort of a head a few years ago as a sort of a learning moment for me, myself, as a writer. So I was in Denmark, and there's this guy. He's become a good friend of mine now. He's a professor at one of the universities there. And he reads everything I write. He wants to someday write, this critical study thing. I've tried to dissuade him from doing that, but I cannot do that. Anyway, and one day we were having coffee. I was on a tour. This was 2019, or 2019 for an orchestra of minorities. And so he said to me, "Chigozie, I've been wanting to ask you a question." And I said, "What is that?" He said, "Well, in your first novel, how is it that the seminal moment, the main moment of the novel, which is the fight that ends the life of one of the four brothers, is actually not in the novel?" And I said to him, "No, Johan, you're kidding me. Of course it is there. There's the fight scene." And, I never read my books. Once I finish, I only write them. So, I cannot go back. So I don't even know. He knows, but and he laughed at me. And he went and got a copy from across the street. The hotel was there. And he read it, and I couldn't believe it. I'm like, what happened? So I became almost ashamed. I'm like, how did I not have that scene there? So I went back to the U.S. when I got back, and I began to look at my archives, And I found in about the 6th draft of the novel. So, so I write by hand, I print, and then I do these elaborate, revisions. So I had written the scene of the fighting, but then I'm not sure what I read. Then I came and I crossed out the 2 pages. And on the margin somewhere I wrote, "The effect of something is better than the thing itself." So that was the impetus behind the idea, doing that. And for some reason, so I went back and then I read that chapter and I was like, okay, well, actually, yes, we didn't need that scene. So the reader imagines the fight scene, and we only see the aftermath. So, and that is, for me, I think, even though it seems in the moment as a huge creative risk, because that everything in the novel was leading up to that scene, but it's not in the book.
It's a fascinating parallel with it's a fascinating parallel with Luke, what you were just saying, where like the thing that is actually defining is left out, but because of that absence, we are drawn in as participants, and that's somehow more powerful.
That seems to say something, I think, about Luke's creativity, but also
Yeah.
in this instance, the personal nature of God's desire to involve us in the story. So if it is a decision of an author to leave gaps to create engagement, God has gifted us with these gaps.
Yeah, that's, which is, I think resonates with something that Rowan was saying this morning too, that we are, there's a kind of, it's something about pneumatology here, it seems to me. Like the Spirit is emptied out into us, and now we are caught up in this as almost co-creators, and both of these give us opportunities to do that. Let me. By the way, I think I was probably supposed to give you this instruction. You know this app. If you want to ask questions, we're gonna. How am I doing, Vivian? Is this great? In the app, go to this event. You can enter questions. You'll get to talk, so keep that in mind. In some ways, I'm struck by how both of your works, even though you're in very different fields, metabolize narratives and stories that precede you, which you then are using creatively or reckoning with creatively to draw readers into a bigger story, a different story. The story that, in some ways, I think it's fun to think of our scholarly work as also a kind of narrative creative work. I love how you said it was sort of liberating for you to realize, no, I'm a creator too. I think that's really powerful. Let me start with you, Chigozie, because in several of your novels, or at least two I can think of, there's a way in which existing mythologies, which are powerful narrative engines, for the imaginations of your characters, but also for you as the novelist, you're sort of making a world because you're drawing on, do you say Igbo, sort of cosmology and things like that. What is it like for you as a storyteller who's creating fiction to then kind of this metabolize other existing stories into your story?
Well, I think it's because traditions are there for a reason. So there's a sort of a continuity thing that you almost as a writer want to situate yourself or locate yourself in and your art. I think is the thinking that this is not the first time that anything you're doing has been done, and you are stepping into not necessarily a well-worn path, but you're walking in the footsteps of people who have done something before. So for me, I think very, very, very much about the source. So the source is the thing. As I said before, so my early beginning is the books that I read, British literature, classical Greek literature, and the African ones really shaped my imagination. In fact, I didn't read an American novel until age 14, something like that. I'm not sure why, but it just was absent from anything, because of course Nigeria, the educational system, even now, is very British as a result of colonialism. So what then one does is, okay, so you look at the canon in the African canon of literature, written literature, especially in the English language, which is now the national language. I begin to find, so I think to myself, with each project actually, where are the gaps in what has not been done, really? And it's quite young. There's only 65 years since things fall apart, for Nigerian literature. 52, I think, up until now, 1952. And so, with an orchestra of minorities, for instance, I read Milton's Paradise Lost, and almost at the same time, I read Dante's Inferno. And I was I was just taken by these two, majestic work of literature, and because they are cosmological epics, you know, the cosmological, you could say, account of the creation of man and the fall of man and all of that, and then that of hell and the underworld. And I read much of what we have in the African canon, and there's no cosmological novel that I could find. And I remember saying to my friend, you know what, I'm going to write one, and so I began to look, okay, which of the two languages and the two cultures that I understand very well, which ones will I pick? And I came up with the idea of the Chi, and so through the Chi, as this being, this index of divinity in every human being, I wanted to not only draw a sort of this image or in fact monumentalize a belief system, a worldview, but also have this liberty to do something new with fiction. I feel like the term novel has to be novel. Each time you engage with the form, you want to change something. You want to adapt it somehow, challenge it, so that if before we didn't know that a novel could be written in letters, once an epistolatory novel becomes celebrated, then now the canon accepts it. It opens the door for it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm trying to attack it from different angles, and this is really, what I try to do. Even with the road to the country, I was in Britain when they celebrated I think it was was it the Jubilee or the centenary of the First World War? I think it was the centenary, and the entire country was shut down, memorializing this war. And you look at the Nigerian Biafra War, 67 to 70, as enormous, as huge as that war was, in which more small weapons was used, according to Kurt Vonnegut, who was there, than in the Second World War combined. And the scale of death, 1.5 million people. And there's no war novel. And by war novel, I mean not, this, you have what I call wartime novels, where the war is in the background, it just shapes the lives of civilians. How about All Quiet on the Western Front, where you don't shy away from painting an image of what it means for a 19-year-old to find himself in the trenches with a rifle in a company of 70 people who have only 40 rifles and very limited munition. And you know that a tank is coming with a well-formed formation. And you know that in the next 20 minutes you're going to die. What goes on in your head? What is the psychology of that moment? So we need to have these things. And so I decided, even at the risk of obscurity, to to tackle that. So well, that has been my project as a novelist.
I mean, I love the picture you're painting, which is that even as you are trying to be novel in writing a novel that hasn't been done before, you are nonetheless indebted to a tradition. Innovation happens within the context of a tradition, and in some ways you've apprenticed yourself to that tradition in order to be able to improvise innovatively. Before I go to Amy, I'd be intrigued so you kind of said, I'm going to write a cosmological Nigerian novel. When did you realize, this actually also is a great device as a novelist? Say the role of the Chi all of a sudden gave you a perspective or a device to use within it. Did that happen quickly?
No, it does. I always so I think about the structures very much, and the funny thing is, if there's anything, I think that, because I don't think that the stories I tell are any remarkable. I mean, I'm interested in two things. I think when I try to write a novel, especially, but even short fiction, it's sort of an emotional and psychological evolution of a character from one extreme spectrum to the other. That is, so I write the same thing. Okay, so a brother in The Fisherman who loves his brothers and would do anything for them. How do you get him to hate his brothers so much that he wants to kill them? That psychological shift. I'm very interested in that. So basically, the it's an exploration of how you build connections, then you disconnections, and then sometimes potentially reconnections. So that is it. A question of minorities. How do you get a lowly poultry farmer, selfless guy, who will try to give up his most prized possession to save somebody, to become hugely vindictive, even mad by novel's end, a total transformation? Because, see, the change in people is, to me, one of the most understated things about humanity. People can radically change. You can wake up one day, even though that process of change is an arc, but it builds in a subterranean way. It's beneath the surface. And the person you thought you knew is not the same person. And people, a lot can be destroyed when you recognize that change. That's really what I try to explore. So then, the structure of a novel is really, for me, the instrument for negotiating that change. So, and that usually comes from who tells the story. Usually the point of view, the lens. So in An Orchestra of Minorities, the chi is this index of divinity in this guy, but it's telling his story. And this guy is not aware of him, and is interceding in this court before these celestial bodies. So for me, that allows me to transcend every possible mechanism of telling a story. He's a first-person narrator, he's a third-person narrator, he's also a second-person narrator when he talks about himself. He's material at the same time he's immaterial. He is present at the same time he's in the past. So the same thing with the Road to the Country. The entire novel is told, in fact, the narrative presence of the novel exists over an 8-hour trance vision received in 1947. But then we see the war between 67 to 70. So which means that the entire book is a vision. So the future is the present. And sometimes the future is the past when we return back to the actual present of the novel. So that's, just thinking about who tells the story and how can inform the structure, shape the characters, and even the plot itself.
Yeah, fantastic. Amy, there's two ways we could, I'm intrigued in, because you're also an ordained minister. So I'm thinking about this dynamic in which, in our creativity, we are living in, appropriating, and metabolizing stories that pre-exist us. In your scholarly work, in some ways, particular narratives have a focus. I'm going to pitch this to you in two ways, and you go with the way you want, or you can do both. One is, I would love to know, what's the difference between working on, say, Lucan narratives and the Epistle to the Hebrews in terms of narrative dynamic? Actually, let's do that first. Is that okay?
I think there's been a wonderful realization in recent biblical studies that probably was realized a long time ago and we're just recovering, that even with the epistles, there is a substructure of a narrative. I think, well said, the substructure of the narrative articulated in the creed. Those elements are there. And sometimes some of the most exciting and recent work in biblical studies has been to unearth those elements of the creed that were maybe quiet or kind of muted, and then to show how they're present in the epistles. I think that Hebrews is a particularly good example. I mean, I do have a soft spot in my heart for Hebrews, who often gets ignored because it's not by Paul, so it kind of stands off in a corner. But this author has this, as you're talking about the future as the past as the present, I think the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews would be like, oh yeah, I get that. Because can look at the life of Christ and show the future of where the kingdom is headed, but then say in multiple aspects, actually the beginning, Christ was already there. The best example is Melchizedek, right? Jesus is in the line of Melchizedek when he becomes priest. And yet, Melchizedek, when he meets Abraham in Genesis, is one who is made like the Son of God. And so it is the Christ's priesthood in the mind of the eternal God that previews even Melchizedek. So there's this manipulation of our understanding of time. And who to say that that author is not working with story, though he pens this story in a letter? Although Hebrews really is a sermon, he just couldn't hang out with them, so he has to send it to them. So it even better qualifies. But Paul, I adore Paul. Paul can tell a story. Paul says, I'm not a good rhetorician. Maybe he can't speak well in public, but he absolutely knows how to tell a story in writing.
Is there, in your book on the gender of God, did you come to any intuitions or conclusions about why the Gospels are narrative in form? Does that make a difference for the way that we could receive them?
I love that question because I haven't thought of it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I mean,
it's so rich. Could the
what would be the
Gospels have been
alternative, I suppose?
communicated in a different way? I mean, I do think there's an insight there that others have articulated, that our faith is not given to us in a list. And again, I think you did such a lovely job last night of saying that's not what the creed is. The creed isn't this kind of cold, hard list that you check. No, it is the structure of a story that we're invited to fill out. But this does say something powerful about we are talking about a life, right? And so much of the work of gospel studies has been to ask, is this an adaptation of an existing genre of the bios? Is it something different that builds upon that? But if God moves in the neighborhood, as you quoted Peterson last night, then would there have been another way to tell that story? And what I think is so powerful about the New Testament is that it is, of course, the letters that are written first, the telling of the story in direct communication to the needs of communities. And only at the passing of that first circle who knew Jesus was it made a decision that we need to put pen to paper for the stories we've been telling verbally. That came later, after the narration of the life in the lived out reality of the communities. Then we needed the story written.
Yeah, it's because I don't know how many of us have come through forms of Protestantism that feel really at home in the epistles and uncomfortable in the Gospels. I think this is not a secret, right? And it just strikes me in the context of this conference how much that maybe maps onto a comfort with discursivity and a suspicion of aesthetics, and in a way to be, so in the sense when you say, if we start to realize that the epistles themselves are really modes that they live out of the soil of the narrative, of the drama of the life, then even the way those folks are comfortable with the epistles and discursivity is in some ways a misunderstanding of what's at stake in those letters.
That reminds me of my early doctoral work. You have to decide what you're going to do, and I chose the epistles because Jesus made me uncomfortable. I can handle the letters. I don't quite know what to do with the Lord I love and serve.
Can I ask you a question as a pastor and preacher? Earlier you talked so illuminatingly about the way gaps, these absences, are such powerful presences in a paradoxical way. What's the preacher doing when she comes to the text? Let's say a gospel text, so it's a narrative. Do you think that there are temptations for the preacher to try to solve the gaps? Do you think that the preacher's vocation is to invite the congregation to feel the absences, to become participants in the story? How do you, as a scholar, but also somebody who's a scholar of narrative, how do you think about preaching in that regard?
I have needed to learn and to grow into that discomfort more in the pulpit. Because when you stand in that place and see the faces of those who are listening and know many of their stories, that temptation to bring resolution is very strong. But there is a humility that takes maturity and development to, in that moment, both leave those gaps and complication, but also leave the door open to hope, so that as the congregants approach, and in my tradition, everyone approaches the rail every week, that you leave space for God to do the work. That's actually one reason I appreciate the move that I made. I grew up Southern Baptist, and I love what I learned about Scripture, but I've so appreciated the freedom of a liturgical tradition that I do my best in the preaching moment, but I have this incredible comfort that this is not the be-all and end-all of the worship morning, that Eucharist will be given, the gospel will be proclaimed, and so if even in my ardent preparation I was inadequate or in error in ways I didn't know, God will do the work there at the altar. And then sometimes the temptation is the opposite. If I really know a text well, then I really want to explain everything. Probably some of my worst sermons have been on Hebrews because I know too much and I want to put too much, and I don't leave that space for the Spirit to work in the dissonance at that place when everyone comes to kneel.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There does seem to be a certain art of withholding that informs transformative preaching or formative preaching, in a way not unlike leaving the fight scene out in order for the person. I love it that you didn't know that was the case. That's my favorite. That might be my favorite takeaway from this morning. In a couple of minutes, we're going to turn to your questions because this is your chance to hear from these marvelous and brilliant folks. Let's. Well, I should say, is there things that you want to talk about that we haven't gotten to? This is your time. I'm just the facilitator. Otherwise, go ahead, please, Amy. I see a wheel turning.
I'm so intrigued by what you were saying and how your work is both drawing from tradition but also aiming to create work that hasn't been done yet. And I found myself reflecting, is that possible in theology? I always tell students who go into the work, it is very hard to say something that hasn't been said for 2,000 years. And yet there are works that are recognized by the community as a fresh articulation of the gospel story. So I'm intrigued with novelness in the work of the theologian. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to put a caveat there to say that in terms of storytelling, I think everything has been done. I have to say. However, that is in terms of maybe not everything, but in terms of plot, especially. The archetype of stories. This person wants something, goes here, and all of that. But what happens is that you have to aim for, at the very least, the illusion of originality. So you become a sort of a hypnotist. Because so I often ask my students, I can be a very challenging professor. You don't want to be in my class. At the very beginning of class, I ask them, why do you want to write fiction? Of all the things you could do in your life, why did you choose this? And they are often shocked at that confrontation. It reminds me in fact, of the way I approach it, of probably the most powerful confrontation in this world, John 8, from 31 downwards, when Jesus confronts the Jews who believed in him, not the ones who antagonized him. And the conclusion was that you are the children of the devil. And they were so shocked by it, uh, because they couldn't believe it. So, so often they tell me a gallimaufry of things. Well, I want to tell a story. I want to entertain. I have something to say. There's a burning desire to right this wrong, social justice, racism in the world. And I just listen very patiently. I'm usually not very patient. And, I want to be famous, all of these things. Then at the end of the day, I deflate all of that. I tell them, see, all of these are secondary. In fact, they are corollaries to what you actually really want to do, which is that you want to give your reader an experience that is superior to what they are used to in their everyday life. That is really it. So that experience is the thing. So, what are you going to tell me about love or hate or brotherhood or, any of these things? I have lived it. Or an 80-year-old. What are you going to tell Amy about somebody who is a faithful servant of God or Rowan or anything like that? But you can tell somebody who has 10 siblings a story about a sibling rivalry that at the end of the day they begin to cry. They feel transformed by witnessing what they already know about. That's because they've experienced something that is superior to what they already know. So if you have that in mind as the sort of, because intention is everything, even in the should I say the skeletal formula for a story. A character exists, wants something, and goes, meets some obstacle. There's conflict. The transaction between the desire and the obstacle is, and then it's called conflict. And then there's a resolution that leads to an epiphany or change. Okay, fine, all of that, but the intention of the character is what drives all of that. A character who doesn't want anything is dead. That is why, in pre-colonial Igbo land, for instance, we didn't have the concept of prisons. It didn't exist. Anybody who committed the most egregious crime was exiled. If you read Things Fall Apart, the community comes, burns down your ancestral home, and exiles you. And back in those days, there's no such thing as immigration. You can't show up at the next village and say, oh, take me in. Where are you coming from? Who are your fathers? How do we know that you are not like a ghost or an apparition of some kind? So they ended up living in the forest and getting killed by wild animals. So, but in the West, the carceral system brings you in, and what does it do? It dehumanizes you by stripping you of the ability to fulfill your desires. That's what it is. Like, okay, well, I want to see the new Gladiator. Well, dude, you can't see that. You're in jail. I'm craving for like a tie, So your desires, no matter how lofty they are, is suppressed by the carceral system. So it means that you are alive, but you're dead at the same time. So for me, the intention of the writer is the desire to achieve that thing, and that's what really drives me. It's everything. It's what produces, for instance, this crazy desire to do, as I said, the dirty work of African literature, to discover what hasn't been done and try to fill in that gap. And sometimes, to my greatest surprise, I've seen a lot of people, in fact, many, I don't, so many, who say, we are now studying Igbo cosmology. and your text, your novel is what we're using as the primary text. I'm like, okay,
That's
interesting.
fantastic. It's fantastic. I think your point too about the way a novel can grant us a kind of self-recognition that wasn't available to us before is probably one of the most powerful technologies of the modern novel. But it strikes me how gospel that is, because all of a sudden you feel like you are seen by another, and that feels like being recognized. And that feels like its own sort of transcendence, and you've been gifted something, right? It's really such a powerful experience of gift. I also want to affirm, Amy, I think your intuition about, hey, we should be thinking about novelty in theology, 100%. I think everybody gets worried, or not everybody, the police, get worried that novelty must mean heresy or something. I think one way to do that is to think about, I think we have territories to yet explore in terms of what the genre of writing theologically looks like. And I think there's a kind of theological writing, or spiritual writing, if you will, that also leaves a lot of gaps. Like, you let the reader do some work, and you're inviting, and I think you have the gifts to be able to do that work. You're starting to do that sort of work. Hey, we're doing okay. So, some questions from the audience. I just read what's at the top. Great. I only use a chalkboard at home, so I don't know what's. So I'll start from the top. Are there stories any of you have had a hard time telling or hearing? Why? What do you think is happening? Actually, Amy, you kind of admitted there was this early doctoral grad student discernment where you were almost a little nervous to do Jesus stories, so you settle on the epistle. I don't know if you want to unpack that more, or maybe there's some other, are there stories that you have a hard time telling or hearing? What do you think's happening there?
That makes me think of a line. You were talking about genre, and I think autobiography, memoir, has been for me very spiritually fruitful, listening to the stories of others. And Beth Moore's, at the beginning of her All My Knotted Up Life, she said, I had to wait until several people died before I could tell this story. So I think I have felt the weight of articulating stories that even in my telling would impact other lives. And that just feels very dangerous. And so I have not yet figured out how to do that with respect of others. Yeah. And maybe there is just an invitation to patience there.
Yeah, that's a great example. Any stories that you
Don't want to tell.
untouchable somehow? I guess you're not going to tell us.
It cannot be, yeah. No, I think, there's a saying in the Igbo tradition, though, that I think that, so the saying goes like this. It is from the home of the, so the coward, looks at the ruins. It is from the home of the coward. It's hard to translate from Igbo. It is from the home of the coward that we look at the ruins of the house of the brave man. Because the brave man plunges, or the quote-unquote brave man, plunges headlong into the war and is decimated. But the guy who is hiding, who is like, what, I have a family, he is the one who survives sometimes. This is not to say that bravery is not a good thing, but there are some times when, even with these ideas of wanting to, fill up the canon, there are some things that you can look at and say, what, maybe this is not the right time, to quote the people having to die, to open up that liberty of space. Yeah, sometimes that happens, but in general, I feel like, as a writer, what you should go for, at least now, with this stage in my career, I can basically write whatever I want to write. I think so. And of course, critics will do what they want with it, but that is not in my power.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's great. I think this is maybe an unstated question for lots of people. Sometimes people seemingly denigrate the power of story by saying things are just a story. Oh, that's just a story. Meaning somehow that means it's not true. So could you guys say a bit about the relationship between story and truth in the Christian imagination?
Maybe that was one reason I was nervous about the Gospels as a young person, because I had a superb seminar, an excellent teacher, but I found myself realizing as a young person for the first time, like we don't have a camera on the ground with Jesus. And that was one thing that made the epistles feel safer, is because it is Paul giving us his thoughts. Whereas this life was lived by our Lord and then later recorded. And so there are these questions of, well, what really happened? And yet, now teaching and living in these texts for decades, as we were saying a moment ago, a real life is going to be communicated with complexity, with 4 eyewitness stories that, yeah, they match up, but there's some interesting, because that's how human life is lived and perceived, with complexity and sometimes what even feels like dissonance. That is more true than if someone, no, I don't want to say it that way, but it is more human way for us to receive truth in the way that it's given to us in a narrative.
More human. I'm intrigued by that qualifier because it's speaking to something about the fullness and holism of who we are.
Right, because I guess even if we had a video camera in first century Palestine, we would all watch that video and then have different thoughts about it. Like, you would never get to a consensus narrative and interpretation. And that's not a problem. Like, so many traditions, I think, out of which I came, were looking for, we all have to agree on all the things. And there are things that we can agree on, these kind of holding, i.e. the creed. But then from there, God wants us to have the creativity and flexibility to say, well, it could be either or both and.
Yeah, yeah. Who was it that said fiction is the lie that is true? Does that sound familiar to somebody? And it because
Attributed to Oscar Wilde, but I'm not very
oh,
sure.
great.
Sure that
Yeah. And it's getting at this sense that truth. I think this is a real question for a lot of folks on the ground, because especially our experience of modernity is a completely instrumental account of reason. And therefore, we associate truth as what's generated by this transactional, instrumental account of reason, which is then what we call facts. And now you enter in your Google search, and whatever gets spit out by AI at the top is allegedly the truth. Because what we mean is the digestible bits that you can put into a spreadsheet, which is an utterly flattened, inhumane, really, way of even thinking about truth. So in that sense, fiction, it seems to me, is just a powerful, powerful antidote to a reductionistic, flattened, dehumanized conception of truth reduced to facts, because it's getting at the fullness of what you were saying, this humanness, where I read this story and I see in it and discover in it and resonate with it an insight into, say, human nature or the world of violence or the realities of injustice. And now I move in the world in a way that I can't shake what I learned from that story. That seems like revelation. That seems like truth, yeah?
Exactly. Yeah. I think that in its truest form, again, the most effective fiction is the art of persuasion. I mean, you're trying to persuade, yeah. Because, see, this is make-believe. See, it used to crack me up when I first started, when people would write to me, oh, I read your novel and I cried, and because, and I would think to myself, oh, how silly can that be? These guys, they don't exist, So how can you get so emotionally invested in people who don't exist, in deaths that did not happen? But what you have done there is that you have suspended disbelief. And for you to be able to connect and invest in that way to those characters, they have become real for you. If not, it's not possible to feel the way you felt, when you read. So you have been persuaded to believe that what is fictional is in fact true and real. And that is the miracle, I think, of fiction. And if you think about it in another way, you would, let's take as a practical example. If I were to tell you, see, racism is bad. Honestly, I grew up doing debates. I was in national competition back when I was little. I want you to challenge me. I don't want you to just accept my word for it. Give me your arguments as to why racism is a good thing. But what happens if I present you with a story, a novel, about a young black girl in the 40s or 50s in the South of America, who becomes who is driven insane because of her craving for blue eyes, you see, just because of the paradigm of beauty. The ubiquitous paradigm was that the woman with the blue eyes and the blonde hair is the one who is beautiful. Anything other than that is not. And that psychologically destroys her. Then I give that to you. I don't think that you could argue with me. Because this is the drama of human reality placed in your hands. What is there to argue about? But when it's stated as an opinion, in fact, you can change my mind,
So there's a way in which fiction, narrative, has a persuasive power that's maybe operating on a different register.
Exactly.
That sort of, and it is interesting then how many people protect themselves. To read fiction requires a vulnerability. One's own vulnerability, it seems to me. I mean, in some ways, it just, first of all, requires the choice to do so, which sadly, so many people don't. But then it means to be a good reader of fiction is to kind of expose yourself and make yourself vulnerable to that kind of persuasion.
An unkind, unempathetic person cannot really read fiction effectively. It's just true.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when Rowan was talking this morning about the novelist who loves their characters. Doesn't mean that they write hagiographies of every one, right? It's precisely because they love them, they show them in all their. I've always thought that's the huge difference between Jonathan Franzen and David Foster Wallace. Jonathan Franzen hates every single character he's ever written. I still read the novels, and David Foster Wallace writes these tortured characters, but you feel such a deep compassion that then as a reader, I feel like I'm invited compassionately to journey with those characters in a way that Franzen, I'm just kind of like an anthropologist doing this sort of weird.
John is a friend of mine, and he doesn't like to hear that. He always
Don't tell him then.
He always hates that people say that. But I think that is true. The generous reading of his work, especially the Midwestern characters, it's not that he hates them. He's a very compassionate guy, but there's an elitism to them that I think belies a lack of understanding of their humanity, because he's looking at them from. He is blind to that, though, but it's true that he is.
Yeah. A question for you, Amy, as a pastor. Although I think this also, your work teaching would fit here too. How do you walk with congregation members who are extremely uncomfortable and even outraged with the gaps that exist in Scripture? How do you walk with them regarding biblical imagination when it's not their nature like it is for others? Like there are some people for whom they just can't sort of sit with the gaps. Is that something you've experienced maybe?
That's an intriguing question. I think anyone who would be willing to have that conversation with a pastor is probably already a little bit open. I can think of probably a few in my congregation who might align with that. But to be a female pastor is to sit in some gaps in some places. And there's almost zero to no communication that would happen with me. So to be what is perceived as an other, or maybe someone who has not been welcome in a space, that's a gap in and of itself, and therefore that doesn't make easy conversation relationship with those who really want it all figured out in black and white, and this is what it says. So I'm afraid I haven't had as many opportunities for those relationships. But with students, even those who come to our college they're such delightful, they're hungry to learn. I rarely have had to encourage them to think more broadly. They're ready to do so. So I'm sorry I don't have much.
No, that's great. That's great. Question for you, Chigozie. How would you advise a middle school student with a budding interest in creative writing who also has an interest in theology to grow these gifts? How can we inspire young people to grow in offering rich narrative? The future generation.
Yeah, which means I'm an old man now, okay? Okay. Yeah, see, I think of what is called circumstantial priorities when it comes to making the choice to write. Because, see, writing came to me, as I said at the beginning of the session, by serendipity, and it was a discovery for me, and I've never left it. But if you feel the spark in you and trying to make a decision, then think of it in terms of circumstantial priorities. What do I mean by that? Okay, so a thing can be worth more than it is, depending on the circumstances. If I say to you, Amy, I'm going to give you $10,000 for if you gave me this cup of water, you are going to think, oh, you're going to call the psychiatry. Please come and get him. He's insane. But if we were to be in the desert and there's no drop of water, I could give you $1 million for a cup of water. Because now it's worth more than even the whole world. Your life now depends on it. So that would be my approach. What do you think you want to get out of doing something that doesn't lend itself to vocation? It's not a vocation. Writing is a sort of privilege. Because, see, the world will not change if I didn't write a novel. It's a thing that is not something that I am obligated to do or that the reader is obligated to read. The garbage guy has to do his job. He has to come and clear the thing. If not, there's trouble. Everywhere we smell. The postman, the same thing, the doctor. But, you write this thing, you impose a story on the world, and it's a miracle that people buy it. Sometimes they even come to listen to you talk about it. Sometimes I'm like, it's funny. The first event, the funny thing is, my first book was first published in Germany. Yes, it was in the German. It was because it was chosen for this book club, National Book Club. So, so they had to get it out in time for that. So, and because of that, the first event of a 27-year-old African guy had 300 people in existence, in attendance. So, I show up for the thing, and then my agent tells me, she's just beaming. She's like, Chigozie, oh, congratulations. I'm like, we're going to see 15 to 20 people. And she said, no, it's 300. And I passed out. The thing had to start like 20 minutes after, then they gave me this standing ovation because they were told that I was about to faint in the in the wedding.
It was a sympathy ovation.
It was a sympathetic one because I couldn't understand how they want to come and listen to me. It just didn't make any sense to me, But that's it. So it's a vocation that can be very thankless. So think of it very well, and if you feel very driven though, and you know that you cannot exist without it, is that cup of water, then go for it. Read, exercise your imagination, and expect that things will go wrong. Expect that the editors will say no more than they say yes. But that's it. That's life.
That's great. I'm glad your novels are in the world. I think the world is different for that. So thank you both so much for your openness, your vulnerability. Please join me in thanking.